What if I told you that the Christianity you've practiced your entire life has been deliberately stripped of its most powerful truths? What would happen if you discovered that the American religious establishment has systematically removed the most transformative spiritual practices from your faith journey? It sounds absurd, impossible, even blasphemous to suggest that the church fathers, seminary professors, and respected pastors across America could be part of a centuries-long conspiracy to dilute your spiritual heritage. The very thought challenges everything you've been taught to believe about your faith. How could vital spiritual truths be hidden in plain sight, censored from pulpits, and deliberately omitted from the religious education you received? It seems too outrageous to consider, and yet the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. In this revelation, you will discover the ancient spiritual practices that were literally burned from Christian history, purged by religious authorities who feared their transformative power. You will understand how American religious institutions have perpetuated this spiritual censorship for generations, keeping millions of believers disconnected from their true spiritual heritage. It will be revealed how these hidden practices, once common among the earliest Christians, could completely transform your connection to the divine, unleashing spiritual gifts you never knew you possessed. You will finally grasp why certain passages in Scripture have always seemed mysterious, contradictory, or incomplete. They are the remnants of a more complete spiritual system that was systematically dismantled. This is the type of content few have the courage to explore, as it challenges the very foundations of organized religion in America. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about Christianity, faith, and your personal spiritual journey. What you're about to discover has been deliberately hidden for centuries, with evidence systematically destroyed, texts burned, and teachers silenced. The forces that have worked to keep these truths concealed remain powerful today, which is why this message could disappear at any moment. Can you handle the discomfort of discovering that vital spiritual truths have been kept from you? Are you ready to embrace the fullness of your spiritual heritage, even if it means breaking free from limited religious systems? Before we dive deeper, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. This helps the algorithm recognize that you value this type of forbidden content that the mainstream religious establishment doesn't want you to see. More importantly, leave a comment saying, "I'm ready for the truth," so I know you're prepared to receive these revelations that have been censored for too long. This simple act of engagement creates a digital record of your spiritual awakening journey. The story of American Christianity you've been told is one of faithful preservation. Diligent scholars and devoted believers carefully maintaining pure doctrine through generations. Sunday school teachers, pastors, and religious educators present a narrative of seamless spiritual transmission from the apostles to your local church. But is this the whole truth? What if the most deafening aspect of American Christianity isn't what's being proclaimed from pulpits, but what has been deliberately silenced? The first clue emerges when we examine what's missing. Consider the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. This collection of Jesus' sayings was widely read by early Christians but was systematically excluded from the biblical canon. Why? Because it contained teachings about direct spiritual experience that threatened institutional authority. The kingdom of God is inside you and all around you, not in mansions of wood and stone. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift a stone and you will find me. These words of Jesus would revolutionize your understanding of divine presence, yet they were deliberately hidden from American Christianity. Or examine the Book of Enoch, quoted in the New Testament itself, yet mysteriously absent from your Bible. This text detailed advanced spiritual practices, the nature of cosmic forces, and direct communion with heavenly beings. The Council of Laodicea in 363 CE actively worked to suppress these teachings, and American religious institutions have continued this suppression, presenting a spiritually diluted version of faith that keeps believers dependent on hierarchical structures rather than empowered through direct divine connection. Have you ever wondered why certain spiritual gifts mentioned in the New Testament seem so distant and unattainable in modern American churches? The answer lies in what was systematically burned, banned, and buried. The Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Secret Book of John. These weren't just alternative viewpoints. They were instruction manuals for spiritual awakening that threatened religious power structures. American theological seminaries know about these texts, but deliberately minimize their importance, dismissing them as apocryphal or heretical without engaging their profound spiritual content. This wasn't theological refinement. It was spiritual censorship designed to limit your connection to divine power. What happens when you discover that meditation practices, energy healing, and direct spiritual revelation, all described in these censored texts, were once considered essential to Christian faith? Your entire understanding of spiritual practice transforms. The early church wasn't just about belief, it was about direct spiritual experience and transformation, elements systematically stripped from American Christianity. But this is just the beginning of our journey into the censored truths. The silence surrounding these texts reveals a pattern of deliberate spiritual limitation that continues to this day in churches across America. What other spiritual treasures have been kept from you? And more importantly, what would happen if you reclaimed these lost practices? In our next chapter, we'll examine the concrete evidence of this spiritual censorship and how specific American religious movements actively work to disconnect you from your most powerful spiritual heritage. Are you starting to sense that your spiritual journey has been deliberately limited? Share in the comments what aspects of Christianity have always felt incomplete to you. To understand the magnitude of spiritual censorship in American Christianity, we must establish the historical context of how these truths were systematically eliminated. The early Christian movement wasn't the unified, doctrine-focused religion you're familiar with today. It was diverse, experiential, and deeply mystical, centered on direct spiritual transformation rather than rigid belief systems. The evidence for this more expansive Christianity isn't speculative. It's documented in numerous historical sources deliberately downplayed in American religious education. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, contained over 50 texts that revealed a radically different understanding of Christian spirituality. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found between 1947 and 1956, further confirmed that early spiritual practices were far more varied and mystically oriented than modern American Christianity acknowledges. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, discovered in Egypt beginning in 1897, contained fragments of unknown gospels and spiritual teachings that were systematically excluded from official doctrine. Stop and think with me for a moment. If these texts were once widely circulated among early believers, why aren't they central to your understanding of faith today? The pattern of censorship becomes clearer when we examine specific historical events. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE wasn't just about establishing doctrine, it was about controlling spiritual narrative. Emperor Constantine, seeking political unity, supported church authorities who wanted to standardize belief at the expense of direct spiritual experience. Later, the Synod of Carthage in 397 CE finalized a biblical canon that excluded texts emphasizing personal spiritual power. This wasn't coincidental. It was a deliberate narrowing of spiritual possibility. American Christianity inherited and intensified this censorship. The Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century, while emotionally fervent, actually worked to channel spiritual experience into controlled institutional expressions. The rise of fundamentalism in the early 20th century further restricted American spiritual understanding, rejecting mystical and contemplative dimensions of faith as dangerous or unbiblical. The development of major seminary education systems in America standardized a version of Christianity that emphasized doctrinal conformity over spiritual exploration. The revealing pattern emerges when we connect these historical dots. Every major American religious movement has further distanced believers from the direct spiritual practices found in the censored texts. This isn't random. It's systematic spiritual limitation designed to maintain institutional control. Consider the words found in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, "Where the mind is, there is the treasure." This teaching on the power of consciousness was actively suppressed because it empowered believers beyond institutional control. Or examine the Apocryphon of John, which taught specific meditation practices for divine connection, practices deliberately removed from American Christian training. When you realize that these weren't just alternative views but core spiritual technologies intentionally hidden from you, how does that change your understanding of your faith journey? Have you ever experienced moments of direct spiritual connection that seem to transcend what was taught in church? Share in the comments a time when your personal spiritual experience seemed to go beyond the boundaries of conventional teaching. The evidence of spiritual censorship isn't just historical. It continues in how these texts are treated in American religious education today. In our next chapter, we'll explore the invisible spiritual battle being waged to keep these empowering truths from transforming your faith. What we're uncovering isn't just historical curiosity. It's evidence of an ongoing spiritual confrontation that directly impacts your connection to divine power. The core revelation is this: the most transformative spiritual practices of early Christianity were systematically removed to create a faith dependent on institutional mediation rather than direct divine experience. This wasn't just a theological adjustment, it was a fundamental power transfer from individual believers to religious authorities. The censored texts reveal specific spiritual technologies, breath practices that aligned with the Holy Spirit, meditation techniques for divine communion, energy healing methodologies, consciousness-expanding prayer approaches, and community practices that activated collective spiritual gifts. These weren't peripheral to original Christianity. They were central to how Jesus and his early followers understood spiritual transformation. When American religious institutions continue to suppress these practices, they aren't preserving orthodoxy. They're perpetuating a spiritual limitation that began centuries ago. The stakes of this revelation become clear when we examine what these practices actually offered: direct, unmediated access to divine wisdom and power. The Gospel of Philip taught that truth did not come into the world naked, but in symbols and images. This sophisticated understanding of spiritual consciousness was systematically eliminated because it empowered believers beyond institutional control. The Book of Thomas advised, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." A radical teaching on spiritual self-authorization that threatened hierarchical power structures. Are you beginning to see why these teachings were so threatening to religious authorities, both ancient and modern? This invisible battle continues in America today through subtle but powerful methods. Theological seminaries dismiss these texts with minimal examination. Pastors are trained to emphasize doctrinal conformity over spiritual exploration. Religious media perpetuates narratives that frame mystical experience as suspicious or dangerous. Even the language used, labeling these texts apocryphal, Gnostic, or heretical, serves to marginalize transformative spiritual technologies without actually engaging their content. Forces operating in the shadows of American religious institutions continue this work of spiritual limitation. Major denominational publishing houses rarely produce materials on contemplative prayer, energy healing, or consciousness transformation. Religious media conglomerates control which spiritual voices reach mainstream audiences. Seminary accreditation bodies enforce theological boundaries that exclude these more expansive spiritual understandings. Have you personally experienced this limitation? Have you ever had spiritual questions dismissed, mystical experiences minimized, or intuitive insights delegitimized by religious authorities? This isn't coincidental. It's the continuation of centuries of spiritual restriction. The modern connection becomes even clearer when we observe how American prosperity theology, rational apologetics, and emotionally driven revivalism all serve, despite their differences, to direct spiritual seeking away from the transformative practices found in these censored texts. Each approach offers a substitute for the direct spiritual empowerment these ancient practices provided. Your personal awakening begins with recognizing this pattern of limitation in your own spiritual journey. The moments when you've sensed there must be more to faith than what you've been taught. Those weren't spiritual deficiencies. They were glimpses of the fuller spiritual heritage that has been kept from you. Your intuitive questioning wasn't unfaithfulness. It was your spirit recognizing what has been censored from your tradition. In our next chapter, we'll expose how specific American institutions actively worked to disconnect you from these spiritual technologies. But first, I'm curious. Have you ever experienced spiritual insights or divine connection in ways that seem to go beyond conventional religious teaching? Share your experience in the comments below. The systematic removal of transformative spiritual practices from American Christianity didn't happen by accident or natural theological evolution. It was an orchestrated effort spanning generations, with specific historical moments where American religious institutions actively worked to disconnect believers from their spiritual heritage. To understand this conspiracy of spiritual limitation, we must examine the unique American religious landscape that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Second Great Awakening, 1790s-1840s, appeared to be a spiritual renewal movement, but beneath its emotional fervor was a subtle redirection of spiritual energy away from personal mystical experience and toward controlled institutional expressions. Charles Finney and other revivalist leaders channeled spiritual awakening into forms that reinforced rather than challenged existing power structures. The rise of Princeton Theological Seminary and similar institutions in the early 1800s established educational systems that systematically excluded mystical and contemplative dimensions of Christianity. These institutions created the intellectual framework that justified dismissing the apocryphal texts as irrelevant or dangerous without honestly engaging their spiritual content. Seminary professors like Charles Hodge deliberately constructed theological systems that emphasized rational doctrine over spiritual experience, systematically erasing the transformative practices contained in the censored texts. During the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the early 20th century, both sides, despite their differences, worked to deliberately obscure America's connection to early Christian mystical practices. Fundamentalists rejected these practices as occult, while modernists dismissed them as primitive superstition. This false dichotomy effectively removed the middle path of authentic spiritual technology that the censored texts contained. The development of major American denominational publishing houses further entrenched this conspiracy of limitation. Organizations like Zondervan, Thomas Nelson, and Lifeway systematically controlled which spiritual perspectives reached American Christians, creating publishing empires that excluded voices advocating for the recovery of these ancient practices. The Christian bookstore industry that emerged in the mid-20th century created the illusion of spiritual diversity while actually enforcing narrow theological boundaries. Consider how American media ministries of the late 20th century, from televangelism to Christian radio, further consolidated this control over spiritual narrative. Figures like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and James Dobson built media empires that systematically marginalized contemplative and mystical Christian voices, creating cultural environments where the recovery of ancient spiritual practices was viewed with suspicion. Do you trust the institutions that have shaped your spiritual understanding? Have you ever questioned whether they might have limited your access to your full spiritual heritage? The modern implications of this historical conspiracy are profound. Today's American Christianity remains largely disconnected from its mystical roots, with believers often experiencing a sense of spiritual inadequacy without understanding that essential spiritual technologies have been deliberately removed from their tradition. The frequent crises of faith, spiritual burnout, and religious disillusionment common in American Christianity aren't signs of personal spiritual failure. They're the predictable results of a spirituality stripped of its most transformative elements. When pastors struggle to explain certain biblical passages, when spiritual gifts seem theoretically possible but practically distant, when prayer feels one-dimensional, these are all consequences of the systematic removal of spiritual technologies once central to Christian practice. The censorship hasn't just limited theological understanding, it has directly impaired your personal connection to divine power. In our next chapter, we'll explore the forgotten connections between these censored Christian practices and other ancient wisdom traditions. But first consider, how might your spiritual journey be different if you had access to these hidden practices? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The spiritual technologies censored from American Christianity didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a sophisticated network of ancient wisdom traditions that understood consciousness, energy, and spiritual transformation in ways modern religious institutions have deliberately obscured. Recovering these forgotten connections reveals not just what was lost from Christianity, but how these practices connected to universal spiritual principles across cultures. The Desert Fathers and Mothers of early Christianity practiced breath awareness, contemplative silence, and energy activation that closely paralleled techniques found in Eastern traditions. John Cassian's Conferences, written in the early 5th century, described meditation practices strikingly similar to those found in Buddhist traditions. Yet these connections are systematically downplayed in American Christian education. The Philokalia, a collection of mystical Christian texts, contains energy practices that parallel elements of Taoist inner alchemy, connections deliberately obscured by American theological gatekeepers. These weren't accidental similarities, but evidence of universal spiritual principles recognized across cultural boundaries. The censored Christian texts reveal sophisticated understanding of how consciousness interacts with divine reality, understanding that was systematically removed from American Christianity. Consider the profound connection between the Christian concept of theosis, union with God, found in these suppressed texts, and the Hindu understanding of samadhi, Both describe states of consciousness where the individual experiences direct unity with divine reality. The spiritual exercises found in Evagrius Ponticus's writings parallel yogic practices for energy management and consciousness expansion. The healing methodologies described in the Acts of Thomas show remarkable parallels to energy medicine practices found in ancient Chinese traditions. Take a moment to reflect on your spiritual ancestry. How might your own Christian heritage connect to these universal spiritual technologies that transcend religious boundaries? These connections were severed through deliberate theological gatekeeping. American seminary education systematically frames these parallels as threatening rather than illuminating. Christian apologetics often positions other wisdom traditions as competitors rather than complementary paths exploring the same spiritual realities. Religious institutions enforce theological boundaries that prevent believers from recognizing these universal spiritual patterns. This severance wasn't just theological. It was a practical disconnection from spiritual technologies that activate higher consciousness. The Christian contemplative tradition, with its sophisticated understanding of spiritual stages, energy centers, and consciousness transformation, was systematically marginalized in American Christianity. Figures like Thomas Merton, who attempted to restore these connections, were often viewed with suspicion by mainstream institutions. Rediscovering these forgotten connections doesn't require abandoning Christian identity. It means recovering the fullness of Christian spiritual technology that was deliberately censored. The spiritual practices found in the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Acts of John don't contradict authentic Christianity. They restore dimensions of practice that were systematically removed from American religious expression. This recovery begins with recognizing that spiritual transformation operates according to universal principles that transcend religious boundaries. The breath practices, energy awareness, consciousness expansion techniques, and communion methodologies found in the censored texts aren't foreign to Christianity. They're essential to its original expression as a transformative spiritual path rather than merely a belief system. Have you ever experienced spiritual resonance with practices or insights from other wisdom traditions? Did this feel like betrayal of your Christian roots or like recovering something essential that was missing? Share your experience in the comments of how you've personally sensed these universal spiritual connections. In our next chapter, we'll explore how to recognize the signs of personal spiritual awakening that emerge when you begin reclaiming these censored practices. But first, I'm curious, which ancient wisdom tradition besides Christianity have you felt most drawn to explore and why? Your spiritual journey might be revealing connections that institutional religion has tried to hide. As you begin to reclaim the censored spiritual technologies of original Christianity, specific signs of awakening will emerge in your personal experience. Recognizing these markers helps you navigate the transformation process with confidence rather than confusion. What religious authorities might label as spiritual disturbance is actually evidence of your spiritual eyes opening to dimensions of reality that institutional Christianity has systematically obscured. The first sign often appears as a holy dissatisfaction, an intuitive sense that there must be more to spiritual experience than what conventional American Christianity offers. This isn't doubt or unfaithfulness. It's your consciousness beginning to recognize the artificial limitations placed on your spiritual heritage. That persistent feeling that something essential is missing from Sunday sermons, worship experiences, or prayer practices isn't spiritual deficiency. It's spiritual awakening to what has been deliberately hidden from you. Another common recognition is increased sensitivity to energy, both in yourself and in environments. You might notice sensations during prayer that extend beyond emotion into bodily awareness. Vibration, warmth, pulsing, or flowing sensations during spiritual practice aren't imagination. They're your consciousness expanding to recognize the energy dimension described in censored texts like the Gospel of Philip and the Acts of Thomas. These sensations are your spiritual senses awakening to perceive what institutional religion trained you to ignore. The transformation process deepens as synchronicities increase, meaningful coincidences that seem to guide your spiritual unfolding. The censored Christian texts described this phenomenon as the revealing of the mysteries, when divine intelligence begins communicating through patterns in your daily experience. When you notice repeating numbers, animals, symbols, or themes appearing with uncanny timing, you're experiencing what the Gospel of Thomas called reading the signs. a form of direct divine communication systematically eliminated from mainstream American Christianity. Dreams and visions may intensify during this awakening. The apocryphal Acts of John described dream communication as a primary channel for spiritual guidance. Yet American Christianity has marginalized this dimension of experience. Your consciousness, expanding beyond institutional limitations, naturally recovers this direct communication channel. Record these dreams and look for patterns. They contain guidance for your spiritual journey that bypasses institutional mediation. For awakening to unfold fully, specific practices must be reclaimed from the censored tradition. Begin with breath awareness, the practice of consciously connecting with divine presence through mindful breathing. The Greek word pneuma means both breath and spirit, a connection deliberately obscured in modern translations. When you practice breath awareness for 20 minutes daily, consciously inviting divine presence with each inhalation, you're recovering a foundational spiritual technology systematically removed from American Christianity. Contemplative silence, what the Desert Fathers called hesychia, creates space for direct divine communion beyond words and concepts. Practice sitting in silence for increasing periods, allowing awareness to rest in divine presence without the constant mediation of doctrine or religious language. This practice, central to original Christianity but marginalized in American expressions, activates receptivity to direct spiritual knowing. Energy awareness practices recover the understanding of the body as a spiritual vessel, what Paul called the temple of the Holy Spirit. The censored Acts of Thomas contained specific practices for recognizing and directing spiritual energy through the body. Begin by simply placing attention on your hands during prayer, noticing sensations that arise. This basic practice initiates recovery of the sophisticated energy understanding contained in the suppressed tradition. Have you experienced any of these awakening signs in your own spiritual journey? Share your personal testimony in the comments about moments when you've sensed dimensions of spiritual reality beyond what conventional teaching acknowledged. The integration of these awakening experiences requires community support, others who recognize and affirm what institutional religion often dismisses. This is why sharing your journey in the comments creates important validation for fellow awakening believers. Your testimony might be exactly what someone else needs to trust their own awakening experience. In our next chapter, we'll explore how individual awakenings are contributing to a larger collective spiritual transformation. But first, what specific awakening sign described here resonates most strongly with your personal experience? Your personal spiritual awakening isn't happening in isolation. Across America and around the world, millions of believers are simultaneously recovering the censored dimensions of Christian spirituality. This collective awakening represents a spiritual tipping point with profound implications for the future of faith, consciousness, and human evolution. The global awakening is evidenced by measurable shifts in religious participation. Mainstream denominational churches that maintain the censored version of Christianity are experiencing unprecedented decline, while contemplative Christian communities, mystical practice groups, and spirituality centers that incorporate the recovered technologies are seeing remarkable growth. This isn't a decline in spirituality, but a mass migration toward more authentic expressions of the original Christian path. Research from organizations like the Pew Research Center confirms that increasing numbers of Americans identify as spiritual but not religious, a phenomenon often misinterpreted as secularization when it actually represents dissatisfaction with institutionally limited spirituality and hunger for the direct experience that censored practices provide. The fastest-growing spiritual movements today are those recovering contemplative practice, energy awareness, and direct mystical experience, precisely the elements systematically removed from mainstream American Christianity. We're witnessing the restoration of spiritual technologies that transcend the artificial boundaries between faiths. The Spiritual Directors International Organization reports unprecedented interest in contemplative practices across traditional religious boundaries. Retreat centers offering silence, meditation, and mystical prayer experiences report waiting lists for their programs. Online communities dedicated to recovered Christian mystical practices are expanding exponentially. Together, we are reclaiming our spiritual birthright. Yet this awakening faces significant resistance from forces invested in maintaining spiritual limitation. Major denominational power structures actively work to marginalize recovered mystical Christianity, labeling it New Age infiltration, rather than the restoration of original practice. Religious media conglomerates restrict access to voices advocating for these recovered dimensions. Seminary accreditation bodies maintain theological boundaries that exclude faculty members exploring these censored traditions. These resistance forces operate through specific strategies, creating fear around contemplative practice, misrepresenting the historical record, conflating recovered Christian mysticism with foreign religious traditions, and financially restricting organizations that promote these practices. The opposition isn't theoretical. It's a coordinated effort to maintain the spiritual status quo that keeps believers dependent on institutional mediation rather than empowered through direct divine connection. Our role in this collective awakening begins with personal practice but extends to conscious participation in the larger movement. By intentionally connecting with others reclaiming these censored dimensions, we create networks of spiritual support that accelerate individual and collective transformation. When you share your awakening experiences, you validate others on similar journeys. When you form practice communities exploring these recovered technologies, you create safe spaces for authentic spiritual unfolding. The timing of this collective awakening isn't accidental. As humanity faces unprecedented global challenges, the recovery of spiritual technologies that activate higher consciousness becomes essential not just for individual transformation, but for planetary evolution. The censored Christian practices contain sophisticated understanding of consciousness that directly addresses the root causes of our global crises, the disconnection from divine wisdom and from each other. We stand at a critical juncture where individual awakening must translate into collective action. Have you connected with others who are experiencing similar spiritual expansion beyond conventional American Christianity? Share in the comments how you found or created community around these recovered practices. The collective impact of our awakening depends on intentional connection. As more believers reclaim these censored dimensions, we create a critical mass that makes these practices increasingly accessible to others. Your personal practice becomes a beacon that guides others toward their own awakening. Your testimony becomes a permission slip for those still hesitant to trust their deeper spiritual intuitions. In the next chapter, we'll explore the deeper esoteric knowledge contained in the censored tradition. Sacred mysteries that reveal the true nature of consciousness and divine reality. But first, I'm curious, how have you witnessed this spiritual awakening manifesting in your community or region? What signs of collective transformation have you personally observed? Beyond the historical conspiracy and personal awakening lies an even deeper dimension of the censored tradition, the sacred mysteries that reveal the true nature of consciousness, divine reality, and spiritual transformation. These esoteric teachings, systematically removed from American Christianity, contain profound wisdom about the structure of reality and humanity's divine potential. The deepest mystery revealed in the suppressed texts is the true nature of Christ consciousness. The Gospel of Philip taught that Christ wasn't merely a title for Jesus, but a state of consciousness available to all believers, a direct participation in divine nature. This understanding transforms Christianity from a religion about worshiping Jesus to a spiritual technology for embodying the same consciousness he manifested. This teaching was systematically censored because it threatened institutional mediation. If all believers could directly access Christ consciousness, the power of religious authorities would be fundamentally undermined. The censored texts reveal sophisticated cosmology missing from mainstream Christianity. The secret book of John described multiple dimensions of reality and consciousness, what modern physics might call a multiverse understanding. These texts didn't present reality as a simple heaven-earth-hell structure, but as a complex multidimensional reality that human consciousness could navigate through specific spiritual practices. This cosmology wasn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated understanding of consciousness and reality that modern quantum physics is only beginning to rediscover. Sacred geometry appears throughout these suppressed teachings as a key to understanding divine manifestation. The tripartite tractate described creation through geometric principles, patterns that structure both consciousness and physical reality. These weren't abstract theories, but practical keys for aligning human awareness with divine intelligence. When you contemplate the Vesica Piscis, the sacred intersection of two circles creating the shape found in early Christian symbolism, you're engaging a consciousness technology deliberately removed from American Christianity. The censored tradition contained advanced understanding of what we might call spiritual energy centers. the subtle anatomy through which divine consciousness flows in the human system. What Paul called the spiritual body was elaborated in these texts as a sophisticated energy system with specific activation points. The Acts of Thomas described practices for awakening and balancing these centers, practices later labeled as foreign to Christianity when they were actually central to its original expression. Numbers held special significance in this esoteric tradition. The recurrence of 3, 7, 12, and 40 throughout Scripture wasn't coincidental, but represented keys to consciousness transformation. The censored Gospel of Truth described how these numeric patterns revealed divine principles operating in both cosmos and consciousness. American Christianity reduced these to mere historical details or symbolic references, stripping them of their function as consciousness technologies. To begin working with these sacred mysteries, practice contemplative visualization of the Vesica Piscis, two overlapping circles creating the shape found in early Christian art. As you meditate on this form, allow your awareness to recognize it as the intersection of divine and human consciousness, the very mystery at the heart of incarnation. This simple practice, performed daily for 10 minutes, begins to reactivate neural pathways that recognize geometric patterns as consciousness technologies rather than mere symbols. Sound was understood as a direct vehicle for divine presence. The censored tradition contained specific sacred sounds and chants that activated higher awareness. Begin with the simple practice of intoning Abba, the Aramaic word for Father used by Jesus, as a single sustained tone during meditation. This practice, described in the suppressed literature as a key to divine communion, creates vibrational alignment between personal and divine consciousness. Have you ever experienced moments of expanded awareness where you sensed the geometric or mathematical patterns underlying reality? Or times when sound seemed to open dimensions of consciousness beyond ordinary awareness? Share your mystical experiences in the comments to help others recognize similar moments in their own spiritual journey. The integration of these sacred mysteries doesn't require rejecting Christian identity, but rather recovering its most profound dimensions. These weren't foreign additions to Christianity, but its esoteric heart, systematically removed to maintain institutional control over spiritual experience. Their recovery represents not abandonment of authentic faith, but its deepest fulfillment. In our next chapter, we'll explore how these recovered understandings align with prophetic timelines and illuminate humanity's spiritual future. But first, I'm curious, which of these sacred mysteries most resonates with your spiritual intuition? What aspect of esoteric Christianity feels most alive and relevant to your personal journey? The recovery of censored Christian spiritual technologies isn't just correcting historical distortion. It's fulfilling specific prophetic patterns described in both canonical and suppressed texts. Understanding this prophetic context reveals why this awakening is happening now and its significance for humanity's spiritual evolution. The prophetic framework begins with Jesus' own words in John 16 to 12:13. I have much more to say to you, more than you can now bear. But when He, the Spirit of truth, comes, He will guide you into all the truth. This wasn't just about immediate guidance for the disciples, but a prophetic reference to future restoration of suppressed wisdom. The timing of this restoration was specifically linked to the latter days, a period when humanity would face unprecedented challenges requiring higher consciousness to navigate. The suppressed apocalypse of Peter contained specific prophecies about a time when the original spiritual technologies would be recovered. In the final generation, what was hidden will be revealed, and what was covered will be uncovered. This text described a period when institutional religious structures would face collapse while true spiritual understanding would simultaneously resurge. Are we not witnessing exactly this pattern in today's world? Ancient prophetic texts across traditions identified our current era as a critical transition in human consciousness. The Essene scriptures, closely connected to early Christianity, described a 6,000-year cycle culminating in a period of both intense purification and spiritual awakening. The suppressed Christian prophetic tradition understood this as the time when the seals would be removed from hidden wisdom, precisely what we're experiencing with the recovery of these censored spiritual technologies. Current world events align remarkably with this prophetic timeline. The unprecedented access to ancient texts through archaeological discoveries and digital distribution fulfills the prophecy that what was hidden will be proclaimed from the housetops. The rapid collapse of institutional religious authority, alongside surging interest in direct spiritual experience, precisely matches the pattern described in these suppressed prophetic texts. The digital revolution itself appears in these prophetic writings in symbolic form. The Gospel of Thomas prophesied a time when there will be no more barriers between nations, and wisdom will flow freely across the world. The Internet's role in democratizing access to suppressed spiritual wisdom represents the technological fulfillment of this ancient prophecy. When you access these teachings online, you're participating in a prophetically significant distribution of wisdom that bypasses traditional gatekeepers. Climate change, political instability, and social fragmentation were all described in these prophetic texts as accompanying the great spiritual awakening. These weren't seen as signs of apocalyptic end, but as the necessary purification preparing humanity for evolutionary spiritual transformation. The texts describe this period as the Great Unveiling. Apocalypsis in Greek doesn't mean destruction, but revelation of what was hidden. The prophetic tradition described our era as a collective initiation, a period when humanity would be forced to evolve spiritually or face self-destruction. This isn't about passive expectation of divine intervention, but active participation in consciousness evolution through recovered spiritual technologies. The suppressed Christian prophetic tradition didn't promote escapism, but engaged transformation of both individual consciousness and societal structures. What does this prophetic understanding mean for humanity's future? The recovered texts describe the emergence of what might be called Christified humanity, communities manifesting the same consciousness Jesus embodied, creating islands of higher awareness that eventually transform collective reality. This isn't utopian fantasy, but the practical outcome of applied spiritual technology operating at collective scale. Do you sense that we're living in prophetically significant times? Have you experienced your own spiritual awakening intensifying in parallel with global challenges? Share in the comments how you've personally experienced this connection between inner transformation and outer world events. The prophetic timeline reveals our current moment as an unprecedented opportunity for spiritual evolution. We aren't just recovering historical practices, we're fulfilling a divine pattern established from the beginning. Your participation in this recovery isn't accidental, but part of a prophetically ordained restoration of wisdom, essential for humanity's next evolutionary stage. In our final chapter, we'll explore the specific actions this prophetic understanding calls us to undertake. But first, I'm curious. How does understanding your spiritual awakening within this larger prophetic context change how you view your personal journey? Does it bring new meaning to the challenges and transformations you're experiencing? Throughout this journey, we've uncovered the systematic censorship of Christianity's most transformative spiritual technologies, exposed the historical conspiracy to limit your divine connection, explored the universal wisdom these practices contain, mapped the awakening process, recognized the collective movement, unveiled sacred mysteries, and placed it all within prophetic context. Now we arrive at the most crucial question. What will you do with this revelation? The journey began with recognizing what was missing. The spiritual technologies systematically removed from, to those who've journeyed with me to the end of this revelation. I recognize you as the true seekers, the ones whose spiritual intuition already sensed there was more to your faith than what religious institutions have offered. You're the ones brave enough to question artificial limitations and hunger for the fullness of your spiritual heritage. What we've uncovered together isn't just historical information, but transformative truth with the power to completely redefine your relationship with the divine. We've traced the deliberate censorship of Christianity's most powerful spiritual technologies, exposed the historical conspiracy that disconnected you from these practices, reconnected you to universal spiritual wisdom, mapped the awakening process, recognized the collective movement, unveiled sacred mysteries, and placed it all within prophetic context. This journey culminates not in passive knowledge, but in radical transformation of how you experience and express your faith. The perspective shift this creates is profound. What once seemed like the complete expression of Christianity now reveals itself as a deliberately limited version designed to maintain institutional control, rather than empower direct divine connection. Practices that religious authorities labeled as foreign to Christianity now reveal themselves as its original heart. Your moments of spiritual intuition beyond conventional teaching weren't rebellion, but recognition of what was systematically hidden from you. I urge you now to take specific action to integrate these revelations. First, subscribe to this channel to ensure you receive the next installments in this unveiling series. There are even deeper revelations coming that build on what we've explored here. Hit the like button to help the algorithm recognize the value of this content and share it with others hungry for authentic spiritual connection. Leave a specific comment sharing which of the censored spiritual technologies you'll commit to practicing daily. This public commitment creates accountability and inspires others on similar journeys. Most importantly, share this video with at least 3 people you know who are seeking deeper spiritual truth. Many are trapped in limited religious understanding simply because they've never been exposed to the historical evidence and spiritual technologies we've explored. Your willingness to share could be the catalyst for someone else's spiritual awakening. In our next exploration, we'll dive even deeper into specific practices from the suppressed Christian tradition, providing step-by-step guidance for implementing these powerful spiritual technologies in your daily life. We'll explore advanced energy practices, consciousness expansion methodologies, and direct divine communion techniques that were systematically censored from American Christianity. You'll receive practical instruction in the very practices religious authorities worked for centuries to hide. Are you ready to break free from spiritual limitation and embrace the fullness of your divine heritage? The journey of awakening has just begun. You're burned by the church, the silenced truths. America, hid from your faith.